Usually, when you travel for an away game, you see crowds of young fans proudly wearing Caitlin Clark jerseys. However, the reception in Golden State was entirely different. The home crowd actively booed her roughly 70% of the time she handled the ball, creating a genuinely aggressive environment. Before diving deeper into this, let us look at some video footage for proper context. Earlier in the broadcast, we shared this clip of her yelling at an official during the opening quarter. It reminds me of her college days at Iowa, where her own father could be seen yelling at her from the stands. These frequent on-court outbursts are becoming a pattern. Even on plays where no foul is called, she reacts by shouting at the referees. The dry erase board was shattered completely in half, and an absolute hush fell over the dressing room as the reality of the situation dawned on everyone. Stephanie White looked completely helpless while her marquee player was systematically picked apart on national television. This went far beyond an off night on the court. It was a total breakdown in leadership that made the Indiana Fever resemble an inexperienced high school group competing against professionals. That exact moment marked the breakdown of the current strategy, and the quiet rumors regarding a coaching change quickly intensified into a widespread demand. The spectators recognized it, the commentators pointed it out, and most importantly, the athletes on the floor experienced it firsthand. The period of making excuses hit a brutal, definitive wall right there on the court. As a defender, you simply have to stay in front of your assignment. But the main issue that nobody wants to talk about is the leadership. This group looks completely unready to compete. They are already exhausted before the opening quarter even concludes. What exactly is going on during your practice sessions? The Golden State Valkyries just completed a matchup a couple of days ago. Seriously, what are you focusing on in training? When I review the practice footage, I see players spinning hula hoops. People are participating in all kinds of activities that bear no relevance to actual basketball or maintaining professional fitness. Stephanie White has left this squad entirely unready, showing a complete failure to make necessary in-game adjustments. It is true that Caitlin Clark struggles on the defensive end, but why implement a strategy that switches on every single ball screen, constantly leaving her vulnerable in one-on-one matchups? The collapse against Golden State served as the breaking point for a season that was already on the brink of falling apart completely. Caitlin Clark, entering the league with more anticipation than any rookie in basketball history, appeared entirely detached, leading to what many observers consider the lowest point of her young professional career. She converted just 3 of her 12 field goal attempts and committed 5 incredibly costly turnovers that directly gifted the victory to her opponents. Yet, the most concerning part of the night was not the inaccurate shooting or the careless ball handling. It was watching the coaching staff stand idly by as opposing offenses repeatedly isolated and targeted her on defense, offering absolutely no strategic adjustments or defensive assistance. At that stage of the matchup, it became obvious that Caitlin was completely out of it mentally. There appears to be a psychological barrier affecting Caitlin Clark right now. I believe she has acknowledged this herself, and it is apparent to anyone who has followed her career. Looking back at her college career and continuing into the pros, her conduct and her struggle to manage her reactions catch up to her every now and then. She failed to make any positive impact during the opening half of the game. The footage I highlighted earlier, where she turns around to complain to the officials over minor plays, was the exact moment I realized this team was facing a serious issue. Shortly after that, early in the second quarter, she pushed the ball up the floor and drove directly into a crowd of defenders, which confirmed my fears. People are starting to investigate what is truly happening during the team's private practice sessions, and the details coming out are completely shocking. While rival organizations are focusing heavily on defensive positioning and executing under pressure late in games, the Fever were captured on video playing with hula hoops and running exercises that have zero connection to competitive basketball. It makes perfect sense why this group appears completely unready and exhausted by the conclusion of the first quarter. When your official training sessions resemble a casual summer camp rather than a disciplined professional practice, you lose the right to be shocked when your roster lacks the stamina and composure required to finish off tight matchups against the league's top teams. On the sports network KTV, they brought up an interesting point regarding their training routine, noting that Caitlin Clark attended a professional baseball game during this road trip. It raises the question, why would you schedule an outing like that during such a critical trip? I understand it was likely a scheduled day off for the roster, but if you are fully aware of how much you struggle when playing at Chase Center, you should be doing everything possible to keep your focus locked on that arena. That matchup has to be your absolute main priority. Personally, I wouldn't be spending time at a baseball stadium under those circumstances. I'm not trying to sit here and unfairly criticize Caitlin Clark, but I can definitely say I noticed some concerning signs during yesterday's events. Maurice, please share your thoughts on this. Jason, we do need to keep in mind that, structurally speaking, she is still only in her second year in the league. The complete absence of game preparation was glaringly obvious right from the opening tip-off. Stephanie White was thoroughly outmaneuvered by Natalie Nakase, who appeared to have a strategic solution for every single move the Fever tried to execute. While the Valkyries were executing precise, intelligent adjustments as the game unfolded, the Fever coaching staff appeared completely paralyzed, leaning on the exact same failing game plans that cost them in their previous matchup. It represents a massive warning sign when a head coach controls the most naturally gifted player on earth but refuses to modify the offensive system when opposing defenses commit entirely to shutting her down. This was far more than a standard loss. It was a complete tactical capitulation that leaves the fan base questioning if the staff even bothers to analyze game film. Consider a player like Luka Doncic, who constantly complains to the game officials almost as much as Draymond Green does. In fact, Luka Doncic has repeatedly come incredibly close to facing league suspensions because of his excessive technical fouls. Yet, nobody steps forward to claim that Luka Doncic is dealing with a psychological issue. I actually think people do say that. He faces plenty of public criticism for his actions, his constant flopping, and all the unnecessary theatrics he brings to the court. There is a great deal of extra baggage that comes with Luka Doncic, and when you analyze the reasons why the management in Dallas was prepared to move on from him, I believe those behavioral issues played a significant part in that choice. Leaving a player isolated in a one-on-one defensive nightmare has become the standard formula for defeating the Fever, and Stephanie White is completely failing to stop it. Opposing teams have figured out that they can simply isolate Caitlin Clark on the perimeter and attack her directly with extended dribble sequences without ever worrying about help defense arriving. Veronica Burton looked like an elite player in an instant simply because she was permitted to target Clark on virtually every possession. Over in the NBA, head coaches find creative ways to protect their stars on the defensive end or implement aggressive double teams to force the basketball out of the scorer's hands. In Indiana, however, they simply allow their franchise centerpiece to be humiliated repeatedly until her self-belief is utterly broken and her stamina is completely drained. Paige Bueckers might not possess the same level of raw talent as Caitlin Clark, but you could easily build a strong case that she plays the game with greater intelligence. Meanwhile, the Dallas Wings are turning into a serious threat. They just secured a victory over the Aces last night. Eric scored 22 points, and Natasha also contributed 22. If I am not mistaken, their record has now improved to 5 wins and 3 losses, following consecutive victories over the Liberty and the Aces. Even though Paige Bueckers isn't necessarily my personal favorite player, she and Azzi Fudd have formed a duo that many consider the defining face of the WNBA community. The playing environment in Golden State was entirely unlike any atmosphere Caitlin Clark had ever encountered before. We are quite accustomed to seeing opposing arenas packed with fans cheering her on, but on this occasion, the arena was filled with roughly 70% opposing fans. They showered her with boos every single time she touched the ball, and for the very first time, we witnessed the elite young talent visibly unravel under the intense pressure. This is the exact moment where a head coach must intervene and offer some protection for their player. Instead, the team's leadership was completely invisible. When your marquee player is being targeted by an entire arena and the opposing roster, you have to implement changes to alter the momentum. Instead, the Fever looked like they wandered into a buzzsaw completely unprotected. My perspective was that we shouldn't create any unnecessary drama with Caitlin Clark. Instead, our plan should be to drag her down to the defensive side of the floor and completely wear her out. That is exactly how we will get our revenge. We are going to isolate her out there, guard her the way teams defend James Harden, and discover if she shatters mentally, because the secret on how to stop her is now public knowledge. Every team in the league is analyzing the exact same game footage and reviewing the same highlights. This athlete will constantly argue, complain, and clash with the game officials. She will openly dispute decisions with her own coaching staff, and she will get into arguments with just about anyone on the court. The blueprint is out there. Let us defeat Caitlin Clark mentally, because we cannot stop her purely on the perimeter when she is hitting shots from the logo. One of the most confusing coaching errors centered around Raven Johnson, who was arguably performing better than anyone else on the floor for the Fever during that stretch of the game. She had just converted a critical three-pointer, accumulated 16 points, and was delivering spectacular individual defense. Yet, for reasons that make absolutely no sense, Stephanie White chose to substitute her out of the game with just 4 minutes remaining in the final period. It was a decision that completely ignored basketball logic and instantly erased all of the team's positive momentum. Even if your goal is to get Clark back onto the court, you cannot sit the only individual who is actively delivering positive plays. This specific brand of poor management is precisely why the player trust within the locker room is beginning to completely disappear as we speak. You probably recall watching football games in the NFL and seeing how spectacular Carson Wentz appeared before opposing defensive coordinators figured out his tendencies. Once that blueprint circulated after his first season, his performance never returned to that elite level. Sometimes it takes an entire year, but eventually, rival coaches lock themselves in the film room, analyze every single detail, and map out a specific defensive strategy to take away what a player prefers to do on the field. The blueprint on how to stop her is fully available now, and we will have to observe if Caitlin can develop a counter strategy, if her coach can design a solution, or if the two of them can successfully work together to find an answer. The heavy mental burden currently weighing on Caitlin Clark is growing far too large to overlook. She was captured on camera yelling at the game officials and showing clear irritation with her own teammates throughout the entire second half. While some observers dismiss this behavior as mere competitive drive, others recognize an athlete who is completely drained mentally and lacks the protective network she relied on during her college days in Iowa. Her father was even spotted by cameras shouting at her to quiet down from his seat in the arena. This serves as an undeniable indication that the support system surrounding her is completely breaking down. An exceptional coach must do more than simply design tactical plays. They have to actively manage the mental state of their roster. Right now, it appears as though Caitlin is being completely abandoned to struggle through her own intense emotions. The Fever's primary trio completely vanished when the game was on the line. Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell were completely invisible during the second half of the matchup, which forced Clark to take heavily contested shots and turn the ball over in crowded areas. Aaliyah Boston stands as the top-earning athlete in the entire WNBA, playing on a contract valued at $6 million. Despite that premium status, she completed the opening half without scoring a single point for the second time recently. When your seasoned veterans and highest-paid players fail to produce on the court, the responsibility rests squarely with the individual leading the team. The complete lack of internal accountability within this franchise is reaching an absolute crisis point, the kind that typically triggers an immediate dismissal of the coaching staff for a completely fresh start. There is a spreading belief across the league that the blueprint for shutting down the Fever's offensive system has been completely uncovered. Rival head coaches have realized that if you play an aggressive, physical style against Clark and throw off her rhythm from the opening tip, the entire team dynamic completely falls apart because there is no backup plan. Stephanie White's stubborn refusal to establish an alternative scoring threat or build a more effective screening system amounts to professional coaching malpractice. A team cannot simply rely on deep three-pointers and fast break passes when the top-tier defensive units in professional basketball are sending aggressive blitzes at your marquee player on every single possession. The rest of the league has successfully adjusted to the Fever, but the Fever have completely failed to counter those adjustments, reflecting poorly on the leadership inside the locker room. Direct comparisons to alternative rising stars such as Paige Buchers are starting to make Fever supporters highly uncomfortable. While Clark may possess greater individual talent, organizations like the Dallas Wings appear vastly better coached and significantly more disciplined on the floor. The Wings recently managed to defeat both the Aces and the Liberty in back-to-back matchups, demonstrating that a structured system and superior coaching can triumph over unrefined star power. When you observe Dallas in action, you see a roster operating with a distinct identity and clear individual responsibilities. In sharp contrast, when you watch Indiana, you see 5 athletes who look like they met each other in the arena parking lot just 20 minutes before the game started. It represents a massive difference in professional execution. The team's defensive strategy, or the complete absence of one, is perhaps the most damning indictment of this coaching group. Permitting rival players to execute 8 to 10 dribbles in isolated one-on-one scenarios without ever sending help defense is completely unheard of at this level of professional basketball. Every other coaching staff in the WNBA understands that if you have a vulnerable defender on the floor, You utilize a zone defense or a hedge and recover strategy to protect them from being exposed. Yet, Stephanie White seems perfectly fine leaving her athletes to struggle entirely on their own. It feels less like a professional basketball game and more like the coaching staff is running a bizarre experiment, and the fan base has completely run out of patience with being the test subjects for this ongoing failure. Commentator Jason Whitlock noted that this entire situation could stem from a combination of mental exhaustion and a complete breakdown in emotional control. He pointed out that while alternative stars such as Angel Reese or Luka Doncic regularly face intense public backlash for their on-court behavior, the dynamic surrounding Clark is entirely different due to the monumental expectations placed squarely on her shoulders. Throughout her college career at Iowa, she was kept inside a protective cocoon of comfort where her actions were validated at every single turn. Now that she is experiencing the grueling realities of professional basketball, she is being treated exactly like any other player, and she appears to lack the necessary coping mechanisms to handle that hostility. A head coach's primary responsibility is to prepare an athlete for those challenges, and White has failed completely in that duty. The team's turnover struggles are escalating to a dangerous level that can no longer be pushed aside. Watching her dribble directly into a group of 3 defenders during the second period highlighted a total loss of composure and a dangerous tendency to force low-percentage plays. These are not basic failures of physical skill. They are critical mental lapses triggered by immense frustration on the court. When a player begins to feel that they must handle every single responsibility themselves because the surrounding system is broken, they inevitably start forcing ill-advised, low-percentage plays. The coaching staff has completely failed to establish an offensive framework where Clark feels secure passing the ball, trusting that her teammates will occupy the correct positions to score without turning the ball over. Even iconic figures like Diana Taurasi are being brought up during these intense basketball arguments. While Taurasi is widely recognized for her incredibly fiery personality on the court and her tendency to challenge everyone around her, she always played under a coaching staff that successfully directed that intense emotion toward winning league championships. In Indiana, that exact same aggressive energy is being allowed to degrade into a damaging frustration that negatively impacts the entire roster. There is an incredibly thin line separating a fierce competitive drive from a complete psychological breakdown on the floor. Right now, the Fever find themselves entirely on the wrong side of that divide. Without a commanding leader to guide her, Clark is placing both her professional reputation and the team's future success in serious jeopardy. The public conversation regarding Stephanie White's potential resignation truly began to build momentum when it became obvious that she was completely losing authority over her players. When athletes begin fighting with one another on the court and entirely tune out the coaching staff during huddles, the end of a coach's tenure is typically right around the corner. You simply cannot find success with a leader who is being consistently outperformed by every rival coach across the league on a nightly basis. The fans are explicitly calling for victories, not just spectacular individual highlights, and the tolerance for this difficult transition period has officially evaporated. If the current staff is incapable of maximizing the potential of a truly generational athlete, they quite simply do not belong in the organization any longer. The core problem is not just the marks in the loss column. It is the specific manner in which this team is losing games. Getting thoroughly dominated by a squad like the Valkyries damages the fundamental pride of the entire franchise. This distinct absence of competitive grit and physical toughness stems directly from the casual culture established by the leadership at the top. When your official practice highlights show players messing around with hula hoops rather than dedicating time to the weight room or drilling defensive positioning, you get the exact embarrassing performance we witnessed in Golden State. A soft team is always the direct byproduct of a poorly coached program. Right now, the Fever hold the title of the softest roster in the WNBA, a harsh reality that demands an immediate change in leadership before the damage becomes permanent. The visible double standards across the league are adding another layer of tension to this ongoing drama. While certain sports analysts attempt to shield Clark from any negative commentary, others correctly note that her complete lack of defensive urgency would land any other player on the bench immediately. However, Stephanie White finds herself trapped in an incredibly difficult position. She cannot realistically bench the individual single-handedly driving the league's ticket sales and television viewership. This dynamic produces an unhealthy power imbalance where the head coach functions merely as a passive observer on the Caitlin Clark show, rather than the individual steering the ship. This situation is toxic for overall roster chemistry and almost always results in management making a coaching change to re-establish proper authority. The psychological toll of this season has also become a major talking point, with several analysts pointing out that the immense burden of carrying the entire league's public profile is starting to break Clark down. Whether she is experiencing severe anxiety or simple physical burnout, it is completely obvious that she is no longer playing basketball with the same passion and happiness she displayed during her college career. A truly great coach would instantly spot when their marquee player requires a temporary break or an alternative management style to rediscover her focus. Instead, it feels as though the Fever are simply running her into the ground, blindly trusting that her raw individual talent will eventually mask their severe coaching limitations. That is an incredibly dangerous strategy to employ with the absolute future of women's basketball. Let us analyze the current scouting reports across the league. Every single coaching staff now understands precisely which spots Clark wants to get to on the court and which hand she relies on to convert her finishes. The reality that the Fever have completely failed to introduce any new variations to her offensive approach or design strategies to create clean-look opportunities for her off the ball is completely baffling. They run the exact same high screen and roll sequence on virtually every single possession up the floor. That simple approach yielded results back in college against less capable defenders, but she is now facing the premier athletes on earth. If you refuse to provide your star player with new options, you are setting them up for failure, which represents the ultimate example of poor coaching ruining a career. The immense frustration among the veteran members of the roster is also beginning to spill over into the open. You can spot it clearly in their negative body language every single time another offensive play breaks down or another defensive rotation is completely missed. They are fully aware that their collective talent level is far superior to what their win-loss record indicates, yet they find themselves trapped inside a rigid system that fails to capitalize on their individual strengths. When your primary trio all deliver terrible performances during the exact same matchup, it is not a random coincidence. It points directly to a systemic failure. Roster chemistry is completely non-existent right now, and the responsibility starts and ends with Stephanie White's complete inability to coordinate the unique personalities and individual talents on her team into a cohesive, winning environment. The closing minutes of the matchup against Golden State served as a perfect miniature reflection of their entire season. Mass confusion across the floor, terrible substitution patterns, and a complete failure to execute plays when the game was actively on the line. As the final seconds ticked away, you could easily read the look of complete defeat written across the players' faces. They knew their strategic game plan had completely failed them yet again. This represented far more than a simple defeat on the official scoreboard. It was a total loss of internal belief in the overall direction of the franchise. Once that belief evaporates, there is simply no path back for a head coach, regardless of how many excuses they offer during post-game media appearances regarding officiating or a difficult schedule. As the fallout from this latest tactical failure begins to settle, the ultimate trajectory of the Indiana Fever remains clouded in deep uncertainty. Caitlin Clark is undeniably a once-in-a-generation basketball talent, but even the most brilliant athletes can have their careers derailed by substandard leadership and a total lack of long-term planning. A total resignation from the current coaching staff might represent the solitary option available to salvage what remains of this season and protect the long-term professional career of their franchise centerpiece. Professional basketball is moving forward at an incredibly rapid pace, and those leaders who stubbornly refuse to modernize will inevitably be left behind in the dark. Only the future will reveal if the Fever management can successfully identify a leader who is truly capable of managing the elite talent currently sitting on their roster.